Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we were going from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games. Of course, we are above 2000 elo at this point. I'm going to do a couple more episodes and then probably restart the speed run, but I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. I hope you guys have enjoyed the series so far. And in this game, we have a Caro Kann. My opponent goes for the knight to f3. Oh, he goes for this isn't the Briar. The Briar is knight to d2, but this is a legitimate line. And the point is that White basically says, okay, you can trade queens and force my king to d1, taking away my castling rights. By the way, if you're a Caro Kann player, you've got to know this. You have to know this line because the temptation is to take and to go into the line. I would strongly recommend that you do not take, and instead just go for the normal plan. You can get the bishop to g4 pinning the knight. You might as well. If White takes, that would be, I would say, a relatively big mistake, because after takes, obviously we have two central pawns, White has one central pawn. The bigger problem, however, is that this pawn clearly has to go to d4 to take any kind of space. Otherwise, we're going to play something like knight c6 and e5 and take the full center. And then White's just wasting his time going d3, d4, right? So if you come up against this system, which if you play the Caro Kann, you will come up against this system, do not take. Just don't take. Don't take. Like, I'm telling you, I have taken myself so many times, and it sucks. It's not fun. So, okay. Bishop b2, as expected, breaking the pin, and I mean, where else is the bishop going to develop to? Again, don't take. There's no need. Like, there is an argument to be made for playing take, and e5. Of course, if we go e5 right now, the pawn will just hang. So there's a case to be made for going take, e5. But there's also no need to give away the bishop pair just yet. You might also be tempted to play the move knight to f6. However, I'm a little bit concerned about e5 there. I don't like that my knight has to go back to d7. And then this knight wants to go to d7, but it can't, right? So I think more natural is probably bringing this knight to d7. You could also make a case for pushing d4, but c3 seems to just put a lot of pressure on the pawn. And if take knight takes, well, I'm just helping White develop, and he's going to get d4 in, and his e-pawn is going to be very strong. Right now, of course, he can't play d4 because I'll just take his e-pawn. So let's just develop knight d7. And what White might do is he might take on d5 now and go, haha, you can't go knight c6 anymore. Which is, I think, a relatively logical way for White to play, because, of course, my knight would be better on c6 than on d7. Although, if we get takes, one, I can go knight to f6 because e5 can never be played. And two, I can just go e5. And again, I take the full center, get the bishop out, castle. That seems very, very nice to me. And, of course, e6 can be played. It definitely can be played. And that would be the more typical Caro Kann plan. However, I don't like the move e6 because I want to put my knight on f6, right? What did I just say is the reason that I'm not playing that? Well, I don't like the look of my opponent playing e5 and booting my knight away, because that restricts the development of my other knight. So, I want to play the move e5, stopping my opponent going e5, and then play knight to f6. My opponent goes knight to c3, applying some pressure to the d5 pawn. Of course, the threat is to just win a pawn. And we don't have queen to a5 check in that line because the knight just drops back to c3. So we have a couple of options. We could consider taking on f3 now, because after bishop f3, d4, that comes with an attack on the knight. The knight is essentially forced back to the e2 square, and then we have loads of options. I mean, even knight to e5, opening up the queen's defense of the d-pawn, and threatening to take the bishop and double the pawns, because the knight on e2 will be blocking the queen's defense of f3, and the bishop doesn't really have a good square to go to. So that's an option. Of course, we can't go e5 because of take, take, take. And we just drop a pawn. We also can't, well, we can't really go knight to f6 because of e5. However, if knight f6, e5, the question is, can we take on f3? Because if knight f6, e5, bishop f3, bishop f3, then we just have knight e5, and we go up a pawn with a commanding position, of course. So what we have to calculate is knight f6, e5, bishop f3, e takes f6, but then I think we just play bishop takes e2, or even bishop takes g2, but probably e2. The queen is under attack, so white either takes the bishop, takes the bishop with the queen, and then we take the pawn on f6, and we just go up a pawn, right? So that's easy. We're up a pawn in that line. The other line we have to calculate is what if after, oh my god, my computer's lagging for like no reason. I'm trying to give some educational commentary here. Okay, the line we need to calculate is after knight f6, e5, bishop f3, ef6, bishop e2. What about f takes e7? That is a bit more difficult, because if we take the queen, he'll take our queen with check. And I think that leaves with equal material. So, because of that, I'm tempted to take on g2, because then my bishop's safe, and I snag a second pawn. And if f takes e7, queen takes e7, or bishop takes e7 even, rook g1, well, then I can just play a move like bishop h3. And that looks pretty promising. So let's go knight g to f6. Like I said, e5 was the line I had to calculate. Of course, if white just continues with normal development, then I can still play something like take, take, and d4. I can play a move like e5 and achieve the position that I wanted to achieve previously. And life is good, right? Life is good. So, the line that I was spending all my time calculating was e5, because that's the difficult line. Like I said, if bishop f3, you're removing the defender of the pawn, right? So if bishop f3, knight e5, then we're just up a clean pawn. So we do not need to calculate any further than that. So this is an important lesson in calculation, right? Like what should you spend your time calculating? Because you've got limited time, of course. So I instead spent my time calculating here, 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 because that's the more complicated line. And like I said, in that line, I believe bishop takes g2 should work, although there is f takes g7 rather than e7. The difference being, after bishop takes g7, stopping the taking on h8 with promotion, rook to g1 skewers my two bishops. And I'm not sure I actually have a great response for that. Therefore, if e5, bishop f3, ef6, I may be forced to take on e2. And yeah, I ideally wouldn't want to do that. That may be a bit of a miscalculation from me, thinking I can take on g2. Of course, we'll have to check that in the post-game analysis. But I was also okay with going into the bishop takes e2 line, because I believe worst case scenario, we just end up with equal material. And to be honest, we probably have a better position anyway. So my opponent goes for it. Now, of course, we don't want to drop this knight back, right? That would just be really bad. So we take on f3. And we're, of course, expecting e takes f6. Like I said, if you take on f3, then I take the pawn, removing the defender, and we're completely winning. Well, we're up a pawn. Not completely winning, but we're up a clean pawn. And our center, classic Caro Kann structure, is very, very strong. This bishop is effectively useless, because how are you breaking down this pawn chain? You need to get c4 in, but the knight is in the way. And c4, even if you do play it, doesn't necessarily work. So I assume my opponent is now calculating e takes f6. Of course, if we take on f6, then bishop takes f3, and we're just down a piece. So we don't want to do that. Therefore, after ef6, we need to do something with our bishop, right? And we need to choose one of the two to take. My first instinct, like I said, was to take on g2. Because after rook g1, we just move the bishop, and then something like take, and we're fine. The problem, however, is even in this move order, g7 is the issue. g7 is always the issue because the rook skewers g7 and g2 in every single line. Therefore, I believe we have to take on e2. Now, if my opponent takes back, we take on f6, and we are up a pawn. So, my opponent has to take something with further attacks, right? It's all about, like, priority, kind of. Like, what is at the top of the list of priorities? And obviously, I'm attacking my opponent's queen, but if he takes on e7, for example, he's also attacking my queen. Like I said, if fe7, I think, well, maybe we can take on d1. Oh, he takes on g7. That's interesting. It's interesting. So, obviously, the point is, if I take the queen, he's going to take on h8 and promote to a second queen, right? That's the point. And the material count there is, if I take on c2, what's the material count? I'm up a pawn and down an exchange. So, probably not good. So I should probably take on g7. Do I have other options? I don't think so. I think I have to take this. Like, this is an interesting line, especially since knight to f6 and the queen has no way out of the position. But it's always bishop g5 and the knight is going to fall. So I'm going to have to take on g7. My opponent will take on e2, and the material is dead equal. But we have a really interesting position. And also, at the end of the line, we have far more central control than white does. I think after queen e2, we can heavily consider the move e5, just taking a ton of space in the center and trying not to allow d4. Now, in fairness, d4 can still be played anyway, because there would be a pin on our e-pawn. Knight takes, I do not understand. That looks weird. Maybe my opponent was scared of this, but, like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not giving away my really strong bishop. So this is good. This is a concession from white, playing knight takes e2. I really couldn't explain the move to you. And I think e5 is probably the way to punish it. Just taking a ton of space. And if d4, of course, if take, that doesn't look amazing for us. I think if d4, we can probably push. Probably. Or, I mean, we can even consider a move like queen h4, preparing queenside castle. That also looks promising. And if takes, we could take with a bishop, but probably taking with the knight makes the most sense. Also, queen h4 just applies more pressure to d4, forcing white to make a decision. Also applying pressure to the weak squares in the white position. Most likely, white will castle kingside, because he's already got it set up. But I want to go queenside, because if I go kingside, I mean, you know, this open g file is very uncomfortable. You know, like queen g4, bishop h6, with pins on the bishop against a king on g8 looks very, very scary. So, normally in the Caro Kann, yes, you do castle kingside, but in this situation, castling queenside seems far, far better. Now, like I said, e4 is definitely a move, but then we give away the f4 square, and, like, there's no need to do that just yet. I really like the look of queen to h4. One, I want to castle queenside, so getting my queen out of the way makes sense. I would love to put the queen on g5, applying pressure to g2, except that would hang a queen. So I like queen h4 because we get out of the way of the king. We put pressure on f2, h2, and d4. We are threatening to take on d4 and just win a pawn, right? Would I really want to do that? I don't know, but we're definitely threatening it. I'm also I'm second guessing my decision to take with the knight here. The more I look at it, the more I prefer bishop takes. And there's several reasons. and I think bishop takes is the better move, even though it's counterintuitive, because normally knights in the center are really strong. But here, I think it's really important to stop bishop to f4, because if bishop f4, bishop g3, then all the dark squares are defended, the g file gets shut, and I have no attack. And I obviously want to castle queenside and then attack down the g file. That's clearly my plan. So I'm thinking bishop takes is better because, one, we cut off the f4 square. My opponent could go g3, but I don't think it does anything. You just weaken the light squares around your king, and queen to e4 is a very common maneuver against g3 after queen to h4. Also, castles just walks directly into checkmate in 1, so we're applying a lot of pressure to h2. Thirdly, we're applying pressure to the b2 square, which makes it difficult for this bishop to develop. Now, this bishop may still be able to develop something like bishop e3, bishop b2, and rook b1, winning the b7 pawn at the end of the line. So I won't necessarily take the pawn immediately, but it will always be a problem, or a potential problem, for white to deal with. It's just a weakness, right? Rook g8 is also prepared with the move bishop e5, because we open up the g file for the rook. And if we can induce a move like g3, then that's fantastic. Like I said, the light squares become incredibly weak around the king. Queen h3 or queen e4 look very nice in those lines. So I do not think that white can really castle right now. I mean, he could try going knight g3 to block everything up, right? Similar to the bishop g3 idea. But I don't think it's quite as good, because the knight doesn't actually defend the dark squares. We could do something like knight f6, knight g4 to, threaten the h2 pawn. And on a move like h3, we can win a pawn after bishop g3, fg3, and queen g3, just as an example. None of these moves may happen, but it looks very good. Also, if knight here, my opponent could offer a queen trade with queen d4. Although I do have knight to f3 check in that line, and my bishop gets opened up on the queen, and I win a queen for a piece, which is fantastic. But, there is a possibility that the queen could try and trade herself off, or the knight could just come here and be a generally annoying piece. So bishop takes, and my opponent's taking a relatively long think, because this is not an easy position for him to deal with. I mean, it's equal material, sure, except I have better central control. This d-pawn is strong. My bishop is fantastic. This is like the classic wooden shield bishop. I could drop the bishop back to c7 if I want, to maintain pressure on this diagonal if it gets targeted. I could even drop back to g7 if I really want to. And I'm just applying pressure to so many different things in the white position, right? Particularly the 4 squares that I'm highlighting here. I'm also preparing to queenside castle, obviously. Something like rook e8, rook g8 looks very strong. Even like rook g8, rook g6, and rook d to g8 looks incredibly strong. Doubling up on the g file. I could maybe even rook lift if the position allows it, although h6 is currently covered, and I can't go via g5 because g5 is also covered. But it's a, interesting possibility. My opponent gets lower and lower on the clock, which is good news for us, because he's not going to have as much time to figure out the ensuing positions, which I think could be very, very difficult for white to defend. And this is also like an interesting case where people say the Caro Kann is a boring opening. There's, I think, a quote from the Queen's Gambit TV series of the Caro Kann is all pawns and no hope. But it depends how you play it. It really does. And my opponent opts for bishop to d2. Like I said, I don't want to take on b2, because after rook to b1, I hang the b7 pawn. So I'm not going to take. I assume he wants to prepare the move bishop c3, offering me a bishop trade. I would be forced, if in this position bishop to c3 happened, to accept the bishop trade, because there'd be a pin on my rook. So I can't move my bishop because I hang my rook. Therefore, I really like the look of the move rook to g8, and I think I'm going to play it relatively quickly to try to apply more time pressure. And this is a really good move because, one, I'm attacking the g2 pawn, so white has to respond to that attack. Secondly, bishop to c3 now does not force a trade of bishops because the rook is no longer on h8. So let's say bishop c3 were to happen. Obviously, I could just take on g2 and threaten queen takes f2. But let's imagine that wasn't threatened. I could just drop the bishop back to d6 and keep it on this strong diagonal, right? What I think white is going to do is play knight to g3, blocking the g-file and blocking the attack on h2. And I really like that position because bishop c3, how can I meet that move if that were to happen? How can I meet bishop c3 that I couldn't before? Well, I think I can play the move d4. I can at least consider the move d4 because the knight no longer controls the d4 square. I control it twice with my queen and my bishop, and white attacks it twice. Therefore, I can play d4, kick the bishop away, and maintain my very strong bishop. So something like bishop back to d2, I can queenside... Well, I'll queenside castle first anyway, but that just looks really strong. I can maybe bring the knight up, well, maybe to f6 to come into g4 to apply pressure to h2. That looks really, really hard for white to defend. And white is below 4 minutes now, getting very dicey. He does go knight to g3, as expected. I do have to watch for knight to f5, but in this position, I have queen to e5 check, and that would force knight back to e3. And then I can play a move like rook takes g2. Of course, you can't take because of a pin, and that's completely winning, or it looks completely winning. So I don't have to be concerned about this for the time being. And I think castling is just the best move. I don't really see anything else. I could consider taking. Well, actually, no, I can consider taking. Because you can't do this because of this. And if this, I can technically take with the rook, because if take, and that looks winning. However, I'm a little bit concerned about queen e2 check, followed by queenside castle, which looks strong. So that is definitely an idea that white has. Queen e2 check and queenside castle, like, quickly. I think if we queenside castle first, though, we take away that option. There is something to be said for rook takes g3, though. There's something to be said for that. Because, again, you can't do this because of this. And if you take with the f-pawn, the difference is we can take with check. Whereas in the other move order, it would be rook takes without a check. And after king f1, I don't think we have any good follow-up, unfortunately. But it's an interesting line nonetheless. Interesting line. I think I'm going to queenside castle, which has a couple of ideas. Firstly, queen e2 can no longer come with check, which is just good, obviously. Secondly, we might actually be threatening to take on b2, because after rook b1 and the bishop moves, say, back to e5, there's no rook b7, of course. Thirdly, we're preparing to bring this rook to e8. Let's say align something like bishop b2, rook to b1, and rook to e8 intermezzo check. Intermezzo being like an in-between move. You can't take because your king's under attack, of course. And then, I mean, how does white respond to that? If, like, king to f1, then the king is stranded in the center of the board. And that looks incredibly promising. We could throw in a move like queen to c4 check, even, forcing the king to g1. And then how is this rook ever getting into the game? That looks very strong. So there's a lot of possibilities here. We could even consider, like, queen a2 if we want to be really greedy in that line, but probably not necessary. And as I'm saying all of this, my opponent's clock is just getting lower and lower and lower. And I don't see him finding a way out of this. 13 moves into a Caro Kann game. This is a dominant position. It's going to be very interesting to see the computer analysis. I think it will probably evaluate this position as relatively equal, but I think white has to take on e2 with the queen, because then e5 isn't quite as good, because after d4, the e-pawn is actually under a good bit of fire in that line. Of course, we can't take because of the pin. I think queen e2 had to be played, but of course we will check that with the engine after the game. My opponent is down to 2 minutes now, though. Looking rough. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far and you're 25 minutes into it and you haven't dropped a like and subscribe already, what are you doing? You're 25 minutes in, bruv. You must be enjoying this to some extent. Okay, castles. Honestly, yeah, it's a move. It's a move. It looks terrifying, though. I mean, you're just walking into all of this. Okay. Okay. Well, that's bold, to be fair. Very bold. Now, knight to f6 is the first move that comes to my mind. Just trying to go knight to g4. Looks interesting. What else can we do? We could go rook g4, trying to double up. And there's some crazy, like, sacrifices where we just sack both rooks and play bishop takes and try and go for checkmate. Although that is a little bit risky because, like, the king can try and escape on the light squares. Alternatively, we could take on b2, of course. And after rook b1, we can figure things out. But I'm not sure I love that. I don't really want to allow counterplay like that. Another move is f5, which looks really strong. The knight, of course, can't take because we have mate on h2. The knight can't move. And f5, of course, threatens f4, kicking the knight away from its strong position on g3. If a move like knight to f5, we can't take on h2 just yet because our bishop gets blocked off. But, I mean, even just a move like queen to f6, hitting the knight, looks very good. Looks very good. What other options do we have, though? Yeah, taking seems a bit silly. I don't understand why we would do that. Again, we could bring the knight... Well, we could bring the knight to e4, actually. Which seems like a very interesting idea, because you can't take because of takes, right? So the knight can't be taken, and it's just applying pressure to all the dark squares. Again, bishop c3, I will meet with the move d4. I do not want a bishop trade, of course. And I can always drop my bishop back anyway, so that's fine. Yeah, I think knight f6 is the move that I like the most. My knight has kind of served its purpose on d7. The whole point was just to protect the e5 square. But now e5 isn't particularly relevant. Bishop c3, we can also meet with knight g4. Threatening mate, forcing the move h3. Bishop takes g3. F takes g3. Queen takes g3. H takes g4. Rook takes g4. I think queen f3 survives there, though. And we don't have time for rook h4 threatening on h2 because my opponent will just take my queen. An interesting line, though. An interesting line. So bishop c3, we can't be too gung-ho about this. Can't be too gung-ho. But okay, yeah, bishop c3, we can just push d4. Bishop e3, we could even push the move d4. We're dominating the dark squares. Okay, the queen comes to f3. Interesting. Really interesting. This is an idea. It's definitely an idea. Okay. My initial thought was knight to e4. Hitting the bishop. Also maybe threatening this. But, yeah, queen f5 is a problem. So what about knight g4? What about knight g4? Defending the bishop, threatening mate. Knight g4. If check, we just move. That's fine. h3 is the move that we need to look at. If... I can't find a way to make that work. I can play knight takes f2, but I think there's queen f5. And it just doesn't seem to fit together. Okay. What if I just move the king? And get out of the checks? There's no bishop f4. The knight is protected twice, so that's okay. And knight to e4 is still a threat. It's still a threat. So I think king b8. I think king b8 works. There's also no queen to h5 offering a queen trade because that's covered by the knight and the queen. I think that's a good defensive resource from my opponent, queen to f3. And also the queen is just involved in the defense now. I think knight to e4 is a very nice idea that we have coming up. We could also follow that with f5, f4 potentially, which is an interesting option. We could, again, I really want to play this knight to g4 idea, but I just think h3 shuts it down, and we're just losing time there. I don't think taking on f2 necessarily works. There's definitely lines where it does work, but I don't know, maybe rook g3 followed by bishop d4 looks quite strong. Whoa, h3 without knight to g4. That's a very interesting move. Okay. Well, now we don't have this, because after knight takes, we do not have mate on h2. So maybe that's the idea of it, I would assume. I'm kind of tempted to just double up, but, you know, not necessarily the best option. That's an interesting move. Very interesting. We could even take on, go for this, except, no, that opening the f-file is not in our favor. We could consider bishop to d4, threatening this because the pawn is pinned. But just bishop to e3, and white is fine. So I think I like the look of the move rook to g6, just preparing to double up. It's not that simple. It's not that simple. Maybe knight e4 anyway. Oh, maybe that's the idea. Knight e4 anyway. Because we're hitting so many things in a position, right? Knight e4, if knight e4, de4, that's protected by the queen, so the pawn can't be taken. The queen is under attack, and the bishop's under attack. So if a move like queen to e2 defending, then, oh yeah, we just take on h3, because the g-pawn is pinned. f7 is irrelevant, completely irrelevant, doesn't matter. This looks really strong. What about knight takes, pawn takes, and queen to f5, defending h3, counterattacking our bishop? I think maybe we play f6 there, just locking our bishop in place, although bishop c3 is now an option. Well, not yet, because the queen would hang, but it could be an option soon. He does play it, okay. I think that's probably the best move. Okay, well, we have a few options here. We could just drop the bishop back, create a threat on this bishop. After a move like bishop to e3, which looks very natural. I don't love f6, because then how do I avoid the bishop trade? I don't want a bishop trade. Rook g5? Queen e6? Holding on to h3, of course. Queen f4, well then you just take. That doesn't work. Can I sacrifice? That should be considered. Rook g2, king g2, rook to g8, king to h1. I can't take here because of the queen being very, very annoying. Doesn't seem to work, does it? Doesn't quite work because I can't access any of the squares I need. If I take, then just takes, king moves, and I don't like that. I don't like that. So maybe just bishop back to c7. I think that's the move I'm going to go for. And basically say, okay, we've got equal material, but my bishop is still a monster. Still a monster. You have to watch the h3 pawn. Whoa, no, that doesn't work. Rook takes. This is Puzzle Rush. Yeah, rook takes g3. And yeah, this is just a classic tactic. Of course, if the king moves, then we'll just take on h3. And then we can come for this. But here, the bishop and the queen form a battery. My opponent resigns because the only move is king to h1, and then queen to h2 is mate. The king can't come to f2 because of the queen, and the rook is blocking the path to f1. Very, very interesting game. My opponent defended very valiantly, to be fair to him. But, yeah, at the end of the day, he blundered a tactic. I mean, the position is still in black's favor. Not by loads, but it's like a -1 sort of position. Let's get the game review going. Let's see what the computer has to say about the game, if it can ever load, please. Okay, so a pretty solid game. 89.5% accuracy for us, 76.4 for my opponent. Definitely a couple of times we could have kept the attack going a bit better, but okay. We open with this Caro Kann defense with d3. And this is slightly better for white. The best line, according to the computer, for black is to go into this endgame. But as I said, I hate this position. It's so... Not only is it incredibly dull, but it's not even that good for black. I mean, in my opinion, this position kind of sucks. Kind of sucks. And also, who wants to play this? So instead I go bishop g4. The computer doesn't love it, but it's a move, right? It makes the game a bit more interesting, and the game was very interesting. My opponent goes bishop to e2, which I think is the most natural move. If h3, you can just retreat the bishop. If your opponent wants to be ultra aggressive, well, apparently we can start with taking, but again, I don't want the queenless endgame or queenless middle game, so I'll just retreat the bishop, and I think this position is just fine. My opponent goes bishop to e2. The computer here wants e6, which, yeah, I suppose that makes sense, but I go knight d7, which is also fine. The computer wants to take on d5, which confuses me, but it wants to play a quick c4, which is something I mentioned during the game. The issue is, if white continues with how he went about the game, you can see the evaluation swings into black's favor immediately, because the only way to break down this pawn structure is c4, because you no longer have e4, of course, because you just traded with me. But even if c4 were to happen, this is still fine. We can take, we can go knight g to f6. It's still a comfortable position. It's actually quite interesting after something like this. We could take, we could go e6. I think I quite like this. But anyway, knight c3, which isn't the best. We go knight g to f6. e6 was also playable. I did consider this, and this, and then this, and then this. The idea being that we defend the pawn and we attack the bishop. If my opponent does something like castling, we just take and we're doing just fine. The issue is, my opponent can just play a move like knight g3, and then if take, queen take, and then the position doesn't look quite so good, because these bishops are pretty good. The knight is going to be very strong on f5. I don't want any part in this. So I go knight g to f6, and if my opponent continues with castling, I will probably push e5 at some point. I could even go e6, but again, e5, I will have to meet with this. But my opponent goes for the immediate e5, which was the line that I had to calculate, and is slightly inaccurate. If I drop the knight back, of course, this position is just better for white in a few different ways. There's even some lines where e6 gets played. Okay, not if bishop takes, but if f takes, the position is much better for white. It does sometimes happen. But we have to take on f3. Of course, if you take, then take, and we are much better up a pawn. So ef6. Okay, yes, we do have to take on e2. If you do this, then you're just down a full piece. I realized if I do this... oh, if this, I actually have bishop takes c3 check. So the skewer doesn't matter. The problem is, if my opponent starts with rook g1, and then if I move the bishop, then this, and this is a fork, and this is the line that I saw, and therefore rejected the idea of bishop takes g2. So instead I take on e2. If my opponent takes back, I will take on f6 and be up a pawn. So he has to take either on e7 or g7. On e7, I was just going to take something like queen takes and castle, and I thought that this position was quite comfortable. Bishop f6 on the way, rook e8, maybe knight e5 in some lines. It's just a nice position. We're clearly better. We have more central space, better development, better pieces in general, right? And we can grind this for a win. My opponent takes on g7, which is the best option. I do not take on d1 because of queen on h8. And after bishop takes c2, apparently the only move is king d2. And my bishop is somewhat trapped. If this... Sorry. This? Why can't you take? Queen a5, knight back. And I just try to trap the knight and prepare d4. That's nuts. So if castles... Okay, then I take on d3. What if d4? Then queen b6 and the engine thinks I'm doing very well. And I'm going to castle. And even though I'm down the exchange, it likes my position. But taking is better. Knight e2 is the best move? Queen e2 is actually worse. Wow, that's insane. I push e5, which is considered inaccurate because of knight g3. My opponent goes d4, which I thought was more natural. And the best move is queen to h4. Just hitting all the small things. Taking makes no sense. Knight takes, and why are we just letting the white knight into the position? No need. I didn't think pushing made sense either, because we give away the f4 square. Maybe not immediately, but like, this does not look fun. The computer's favorite move is knight to f8, bringing the knight into the light squares, because it's not a fun position. So, we go queen to h4. My opponent takes on e5. And I take on e5 with the bishop. Taking with the knight is fine, but not quite as good. For some of the reasons I explained. This bishop is an absolute monster. Bishop d2 played. Not a particularly good move. Better is g3, which I'm not going to lie, looks terrible. I mean, yeah, you have to find f3 here to survive. And I mean, does not look good. Bishop d2 is chosen. And the computer wants me to queenside castle here. And if bishop here, it wants d4. And if you take, I just do this, and you can't castle because of this. So this is threatened with discovered check. So the king has to move. And then I unleash a pin here. Okay. I chose rook g8, though. I did not see that line. I'd argue this is the easiest line. And knight g3. g3 again is the best move, but again, this looks very, very scary. After queenside castle, I suppose my rook isn't behind this pawn anymore, but still h5, h4 is coming, and I would not want to play this with white. So knight g3, I castle queenside, which is the only move that maintains a good advantage. This made no sense to me. Whoa, what? And if the king moves? And that's very nice, actually. But unreasonable to actually find. My opponent castles. And here, I went knight to f6. And f5 is another move I considered. The computer prefers the move f5, trying to play f4. And I assumed my opponent had to respond with f4 to stop me from doing it. And after here, check, king over. If this, then there's this. Of course, you can't take the pin. But I mean, I still have lots of options. The computer likes queen back to f6, which threatens this, this, and this. So bishop e1 would have to be played. And then we can just drop the bishop back, and we have a very pleasant position up a pawn, and the white king is really not in good stead. You probably have to do this. But I chose knight to f6, which is still good. Queen to f3 is the best move. And here, I went king to b8, but the computer wants knight to g4 anyway. Of course, this is the threat, right? Picking up my bishop, which is why I moved my king. Knight g4, what about after this? It does want knight takes f2. See, I thought that, okay, if rook takes, then we're winning. We're up a pawn. The rook is completely exposed. white king is completely exposed, and we should be able to win this position. Although queen b2 is not the most natural move in the world. However, I thought that after h3 and knight takes f2, that white had queen to f5. And the thing is, white does have queen to f5, unless I find rook d7. And after this, we get a similar sort of position. But I did not see rook d7. What I saw was king b8 and queen takes e5, and I'm completely losing here. Because after the king moves, my opponent... king takes is actually better, but let's say rook takes, and let's say this, and let's say this, and this. I'm just down a full piece. So, I went king b8. My opponent here has to find rook a to e1, apparently. He goes h3, and knight to e4 is the only good move in this position. Nothing else works. Yeah, because if you take here after this, you can go for this, but you'll hang the knight. So the best move is this. And if this, then this. But I mean, it's still not great. So knight e4. And I figured you had to take this. The computer prefers this, but of course, worst case scenario, I can just snap the pawn on g3, play something like rook takes, and I'm up a pawn. Engine thinks that this is playable, which I suppose, yeah, that's actually very playable. But that's also a very complicated line. Knight e4 is quite strong. If knight e4, which my opponent played, computer wants queen e4, which I've got to admit, I didn't even consider. I thought we should keep the queens on the board. And the only move that doesn't lose is queen to f5, which is what my opponent finds. Anything else, like queen e3 defending, I just double the rooks, and like the game is over. You're holding on to everything for now, but it's not going to last. Because let's say rook here, rook d to g8, how are you defending yourself? Again, if g3, I can just take it with basically anything, or even take on h3. Everything is winning. Even f5 wins. So queen f5, the only move, and bishop c7 is the best response. Taking here makes no sense. Why are we just allowing an equal position? I have a rook on the second rank, sure, but like, that's not really that relevant right now. Because I'm trying to attack. So bishop back to c7, maintaining my bishop. And there's only one move in this position to save this bishop, which I saw, which is bishop to e3, which is what I expected. And I think I was just going to double up on the g file with something like rook g6, which the computer approves of. It prefers doing it this way, which I've got to admit I don't quite understand. Yeah, I mean, this is not a very human way to play the position, but you can see how it's completely winning. My opponent goes g3, though, and I mean, that just blunders puzzle rush tactics with rook g3. And how do you find a move like that? I mean, you just see that everything is pointed at the white king. Literally everything. Obviously, we could just take on d2, and the queen isn't even hanging because of the pin. But rook g3 is game over. If the king moves, we take. And I mean, something like this. No, not that. Not that. But this is game over. f3 is covered. Interestingly, I think this is still winning. No, it's apparently drawing after this, which is quite funny. But yeah, f takes, queen takes, king has one move. My opponent resigns because mate is inevitable. I hope you guys enjoyed this game. Let me know what you think about restarting the speedrun. I'll probably restart it from about 1000 elo. I know a lot of you are around that level, so that might be very useful for you guys to see me play against people of your own rating level. So comment down below what you think about that. If you want to see another very interesting Caro Kann video, check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.